I think the solution you talk about merging Hezbollah with the Lebanese army, I think that's going to be in the aftermath of the ending to the occupation of Lebanon. Because before ending the occupation, before putting an end, and
Yep.
just Israel has to wither. There is no way for Israel staying there. And you talk about the future of, what would be the future of Lebanon, because that's the main reason of having a group like Hezbollah in Lebanon is the occupation of Lebanon. They were not that's because the very existence, it was in 1980, if I'm not mistaken, they came into existence because of the occupation, which has happened before the formation of Hezbollah. These are so important. They're so complicated, but when you look at the situation, first of all, you have to remove the occupation. You have to do something about the occupation. Then talking about what would be Lebanon. Then they're going to redefine themselves, maybe in the aftermath of, ending Israeli occupation of Lebanon.
Yeah, that's absolutely right. And of course, Israel will insist on, the Hezbollah needs to disarm before they withdraw any troops. And so this ceasefire agreement, which was not conducted between opposition military forces, as you mentioned, it's like having a treaty it's like the Treaty of Versailles, basically. The Treaty of Versailles was called a diktat by the Germans because they didn't have any influence on it. They were asked to sign it, and ultimately, when they were asked to sign it, they got a couple of last-minute concessions, but they were locked out of the negotiations. So it was essentially an unconditional surrender on them. And that's essentially what this is for Hezbollah, because they were not allowed to participate. Iran was not allowed to participate. So basically, it was a one-sided, it was like allies, negotiating with each other. It's like the U.S. and Ukraine and the EU getting together and negotiating a peace treaty for Russia and saying, okay, you got to sign this, or, you don't even need to sign it. This is the way it's going to be, essentially. Like, they're not even asking Hezbollah to sign or approve it. So it's really just a propaganda, measure. It really has no validity. It's never going to be implemented. But basically, what it does is it legitimizes a permanent Israeli occupation of the southern fifth of Lebanese territory, which of course is Shiite. They've ethnically cleansed the 200,000 Shiite Lebanese from southern Lebanon and have obliterated all their houses. They've essentially Gazified it. Just as they've destroyed 92% of Gazan homes. There's over a million Lebanese refugees, and the U.S. has a tremendous amount of diplomatic heft, which we are refusing to use in terms of the Trump administration to try to rectify the situation with a just and lasting peace for Lebanon. And a just and lasting peace for Lebanon means no Israeli occupation troops.
David, what is your understanding of some people like Mike Huckabee, the American ambassador to Israel, which basically says without Israel, we wouldn't have existed. The United States, he's talking about the United States. I don't know what is his understanding of the United States and Israel, because as I understand it, Israel was founded in 1948. So how is that something religious in his mind, or what is your understanding of that? Because these people are decision makers when it comes to the situation in the Middle East.
Yeah, Mike Huckabee is the evangelical Christian, and he's misinterpreted a verse in the Bible that talks about how the Lord will bless Abraham and his descendants, and anyone who blesses Abraham and his family will be blessed. Anyone who curses them will be cursed. Well, guess what? According to the Bible, basically the entire Arab nation, which is scattered among multiple different, a dozen or more different countries, are children of Abraham through Ishmael. So, that can be used both ways. If we're sitting by and doing nothing as innocent Gazan civilians and Lebanese are being slaughtered, all life is equal in the eyes of God. That's in the Bible. So as Christians, we are supposed to believe that. But Christians seem to believe that the value of Jewish lives are somehow higher in God's eyes than Muslim lives, and that's just simply not the case. And so Huckabee is delusional. Obviously, President Trump responded and said, he said multiple times, he said Israel would not exist without the U.S. If it had ever existed, it would be destroyed by now without U.S. assistance. And I think he's largely correct. But Huckabee's statement has no basis in fact. It's part of his delusional theology, which is, it twists the Bible in ways that never were meant to be, because obviously Israel didn't exist. This wasn't talking about Israel, the modern state of Israel, because Israel didn't exist at that time. That was 1500 BC or thereabouts, 1400 BC. And, this Israel didn't exist until 1948. So Israel it's a great country, but it's led by, far-right extremists that are basically Hitlerian aggressors. Obviously, they're not genocidal on the level of Hitler, but in terms of a rogue state aggressor, that's what Netanyahu is. And unfortunately, most Israeli leaders are that way as well. I'd love to see the leader of the Democrat Party in Israel, who's admittedly somewhat of a socialist. He's really the leader of the only Zionist party that supports peace with Israel's neighbors, and that's exactly what Israel needs right now. We don't need regime change in Iran. We need regime change in Israel to a peace-loving government that's willing to withdraw Israeli forces from neighboring regions to ensure a just and lasting peace in the region.
Do you think when Donald Trump suggests Syria may play a big role in Lebanon, what does he mean by that? Is he talking about the new factions in Syria being used in Lebanon, or the government? Because the government in Syria came out and said, we're not going to be part of this. We're not going to attack. We're not going to participate. But there's some sort of factions in Syria who are fighting the other factions of ISIS in Syria. It's just amazing how Syria is today. But they're literally those people who were in Idlib and then they came to Damascus, they're fighting among each other. And that Donald Trump is saying, let's put this chaos, let's remove it from here, put it in Lebanon. To me, it's the recipe for chaos and new problems for the region. And I don't know how is that going to help Donald Trump.
Well, I think Trump is obviously very frustrated with the Israeli invasion and continued occupation of Lebanon, but he's clearly not willing to do anything about it. And this ceasefire agreement proves that, because it's meant to be a lasting ceasefire. And obviously, we talked about how Israel violated the very next day with two separate attacks on Hezbollah and killing a couple of innocent girls. So I think that Syria, obviously historically under Assad, was a stabilizing influence in Lebanon. There was a Syrian military presence. Syria helped provide security against Israel for some period of time, but also stabilized their politics. Essentially made Lebanon kind of a Syrian vassal state, and obviously Syria was an Iranian ally, as Iraq is today. And now it no longer is. So I think the idea that Trump has is, is Muslim troops or Muslim forces would do a lot better job stabilizing the situation, because presumably they wouldn't be there for occupation or conquest. They would serve more as peacekeepers, ideally to replace the Israeli occupation troops. So I think in concept, if Syria was a stable government led by a secular leader that wasn't kind of an Al-Qaeda head chopper as al-Shara was, I think that's a reasonable idea. And if Syria was indeed a neutral arbiter from a Muslim country again, or Arab country, either Turkish or Syrian or even Egyptian troops. The idea of them being peacekeepers to replace the Israelis, and maybe, or even the U.S. I mean, I don't want U.S. troops in Lebanon, but even U.S. troops guarding the southern border between Hezbollah and Israel and allowing civilians to return to their what little homes they have left. I think that's a promising idea. So I think President Trump's onto something. But as you mentioned, al-Shara doesn't seem interested in doing that. But of course, I think he could be induced to, by financial promises of assistance, perhaps in the billions of dollars. I think he could warm up to the idea. But obviously, he's going to only want to do that if, with some kind of level of Israeli concurrence. And Netanyahu has made very clear that Israel is not going to agree to withdraw any troops aside from these two tiny little pilot zones that they are transitioning over to Lebanese army control.
Yeah, from the Iranian sources, so far we've learned they may not go for the next round of negotiations and to talk with the United States because of what has happened last night. It seems some channels reported in Iran that their IRGC is moving their weapons around the country. I don't know if some sort of attack would happen tonight. But the situation is so critical. I don't know, because the other thing that has happened, J.D. Vance, right after the second round of negotiations, said there is a new line of communications between Iran and the United States to manage the Strait of Hormuz. Then IRGC last night came out and said there is nothing of that sort happening between us. So there is no communication between the two sides to manage the Strait of Hormuz, which we were told by J.D. Vance that there is. And tonight, it seems that we're going to have some more escalations in the region. And how do you see the whole concept of the situation in the Persian Gulf and the way that Donald Trump, instead of talking between the two sides, because in Iran it's not just simple, because many people, when it comes to Iran, say, oh, these people are in charge, we're going to do this and they're going to accept, and they have their differences. Like the United States, you see the different forces within the Trump administration. We have two factions basically fighting each other. The same thing is happening in Iran. We have two sides. One of them is more military they have the military sort of mindset to do it militarily. The other part is basically inclined toward more negotiation, more talks. But after all, they're going to decide if these escalations happen and continue to happen, it's going to be critical for the region.
Yeah, so there was an operation called Project Freedom, as I'm sure you and your viewers remember, and that's when the U.S. sent 3 U.S. Navy destroyers through the strait, and they came under immediate Iranian attack with drones and missiles and fast missile boats. And in response to that, the initial response of the Trump administration was that did not warrant a U.S. retaliatory response. That did not rise to the level of requiring a major combat response. And my argument would have been, if I had been Trump's advisor, is that this was an IRGC attack on a neutral ship. It's not a U.S. ship. It's a Singaporean ship. The ship survived with relatively light damage. It had moderate damage to the bridge. It successfully transited the Strait of Hormuz. And no casualties. So this does not warrant a U.S. military response. It warranted a diplomatic protest, as a violation of the ceasefire, and we absolutely should have given a strong warning that would not be tolerated in the future. But Trump simply overreacted and escalated by attacking Iran directly with military strikes that should not have happened. And it was complete violation of the spirit of the ceasefire MOU, which he had been implementing for, I think, 12 days, essentially, if you count from the 24th or the 14th of June when he electronically signed it and first announced it. So President Trump is often his worst enemy. He sabotages his own peace agreements, his own foreign policy. He famously goes back and forth. He flips-flop. He gets really tough on Netanyahu privately, and then he backs off publicly, lets them have whatever they want. So, this is the problem with, having a leader of a superpower that is unstable. It's fundamentally unhinged and unstable. And, he started out as a noble, courageous peace president. He talked about ending all the conflicts, not starting any foreign wars. And now he started a war that he doesn't know how to finish. And the way to finish it is to implement the ceasefire agreement and to basically ignore any minor, what I would consider relatively minor Iranian violations. Simply give verbal protests and then back it up with a proportional response if they do it again. But the way he escalated suggests that he doesn't understand how to de-escalate the war. And if you don't de-escalate the war, it can continue to escalate out of control. And pretty soon, the bombings will resume daily bombing strikes. U.S. on Iran and Iran on the U.S. military bases in 6 different countries the same day. And I don't think that's what he wants. But unfortunately for the U.S., Iran has something that the U.S. doesn't have, and that's control of the Strait of Hormuz, which if they shut down again, they can easily cause a global depression within a year's time. So I don't think that's President Trump clearly stated the main reason he decided to sign the deal on Iranian terms, basically accepted virtually all of them, the terms that he previously said weren't acceptable, is because he didn't want to be another Herbert Hoover and lead the U.S. into a second Great Depression. And unfortunately, he seems to be forgetting that that's pretty critical, and that if he continues to attack Iran, it's almost inevitable that they'll reclose the strait.
I think what the United States with the recent visit of Marco Rubio is trying to do is trying to balance the Strait of Hormuz politically in the region, going to Bahrain, Kuwait, and UAE, talking with them, trying to put pressure on Oman and convincing them that maybe these tankers can use the Omani routes to pass through the Strait of Hormuz. Then IRGC coming out and hitting some of these tankers and ships and vessels. This is because the leverage on the part of Iranians is militarily. Their presence in the Persian Gulf, in the Strait of Hormuz, they're controlling that region. But they're trying to go and convince the Omani government, which was not part of the conflict. They were not part of the war. They were not, they tried to do their best to bring two sides together. And right now, this political move, I don't know what Marco Rubio is seeking for. Because the guy, whenever he goes to Europe, makes new troubles, goes to the Middle East, make new troubles. He's not the solution, at least for the last 12 months or more than a year that he's in office. He's the Secretary of State of the United States.
Yeah, Rubio is really the worst person. I mean, he famously went to renegotiate the 28-point peace plan between Trump and Russia for to end the Ukraine war, of which I assessed 25 points were acceptable to Russia. And then he basically replaced it with Zelensky's peace plan, which is a maximalist peace plan that Russia rejected in its entirety. And he said, oh, the agreement's much better now, much better that we caved to all of Zelensky's terms and threw all Trump's terms in the trash can. So he is someone who is known for work against U.S. national security interests. He's essentially a bot politician by Israel and to a lesser extent Ukraine, and he's a neocon, and like you said, he supports every war. He loved the Iran war. He didn't, he wasn't vocal in support of it, but he's been very vocal in support of it since it started. And he just causes trouble wherever he goes, and he's extremely pro-Israel. He has zero strategic empathy for Hezbollah or the Gazans or the Iranians. He doesn't accept any of the legitimate reasons they have to defend themselves and defend their own countries, like J.D. Vance has. J.D. Vance has pointed out that Iran is a great power, but he hasn't said the words great power, but he said that Iran has the right to self-defense just as much as Israel. They have the right to have ballistic missiles. Trump says they have the right to enrich, up to 3.67%, so they can have their own nuclear energy and just all the rights of a normal country under international law. But Rubio doesn't believe that. Rubio sees everything as black and white. He sees the Israelis as God's soldiers here on earth, essentially, and fighting God's wars, and all of their enemies are automatically evil. And in fact, it's much more gray. Both the Iranians have, they've obviously, the Islamist regime has killed off, I think, 6,700 protesters by my count, certainly not the 40,000 or 20,000 that we've heard by propaganda sources. But those protesters were called into action by the Mossad and the CIA. They'd still be alive today if we hadn't basically got them to rebel and get Iran to the regime to kill them off. But Israel is an equally murderous regime that's killed many more people in a much shorter period of time than the Iranians have during the last 3 years. So why is the U.S. taking sides? The U.S. should be completely neutral, and I've discussed this on your show before. The U.S. Should pursue a policy of benevolent neutrality, which is we won't ally with Israel. Obviously, we won't ally with Iran, but we won't ally with Israel. We will sell arms to Israel if they behave, and if they don't invade or commit international aggressions against their neighbors, unprovoked aggressions. But if they do, we'll cut off all security assistance and all defense cooperation, including intelligence. And that's something I think J.D. Vance would be willing to consider if he was president. And hopefully he will be elected president in 2028 with the support of Tucker Carlson and many others who have left Trump's orbit and don't support Trump over his decision to put Israel first over America. But that's what we need. We need a president who is truthfully a peace president, who doesn't start new wars and does everything in his power to end the ones that we have right now.
To your understanding, David, do you think that there is some sort of division, somehow forming among the Arab states in the Persian Gulf?
Well, I think the Arab states in the Gulf region are being forced to confront a new reality, which is that the U.S. Security guarantees were mostly worthless because the U.S. Decided to reposition many of its missile defense systems from the Gulf region to Israel. They prioritized the defense of Israel over the Gulf states, and obviously the Gulf states are more exposed, so there's obviously less that we could do to defend against Iranian missile strikes due to their proximity to Iran. But essentially, the U.S. Navy obviously has proved powerless to overcome Iranian naval strength and military strength in the Persian Gulf and the Strait of Hormuz. And so Iran has proven that it is a major regional power and incoming regional hegemon to be reckoned with. And as a result, countries like, I think even Qatar was talking about sharing their electrical power system with Iran so that Iran wouldn't want to attack them again. And they're making all kinds of, security, increased diplomatic agreements and potentially future security agreements where, to do everything in their power to de-incentivize Iran from wanting to attack them again. Ultimately, the answer, of course, is to expel U.S. military forces from their countries. And then, like Oman, even though Oman does have a U.S. military base, as you mentioned, Iran didn't attack them because the Omanis were very, very genuine in trying to negotiate a peace deal on the nuclear issue before the war started. And in fact, Iran did offer a very promising nuclear deal, which is much better than anything we could hope to achieve now that we've killed off Iran's first family, supreme leader, and 50 other leaders, and killed off 1,700 civilians, including 150, 160 girls in that double tap tomahawk attack on the first couple days of the war.